Thanks everyone for joining this webinar. I'm going to wait another 15 or 20 seconds to allow more folks to enter the room before I begin the program. All right, welcome everyone to today's discussion, the title of which is the Democratic Party small d democratic enough? My name is Archon Fung, and I'm the Winthrop Laughlin McCormick Professor of Citizenship and Self-Government here at the Harvard Kennedy School and Director of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. I want to start off with a few announcements before I introduce our panelists and today's topic. First of all, the Ash Center acknowledges that the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Today's discussion is being recorded, and you will receive a link to that recording in an email following the conclusion of today's event. You will also be able to find it on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. We're going to reserve the last 15 to 20 minutes to respond to questions from the audience. Questions may be submitted anytime via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This summer, we saw the dizzying shift from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris as the Democratic Party's candidate for president. Now, everyone knows that a big part of the Democratic Party's appeal to Americans to vote for them is that it is the party that is standing up for democracy. Yet Biden got to the top of the ticket through a largely uncontested, save for Dean Phillips, primary process, and then Harris replaced him basically without any consideration of alternative leaders or ratification from party members or Americans at large. Many capital D Democrats seem thrilled with this choice, but how should Americans as small d Democrats regard these surprising and I dare say norm-breaking turns? Looking forward, should the selection of party leaders be more small d Democratic or not? Some people have said to me that this isn't really a good time to have this conversation because these events have already happened. But in another light, there is no good time to have this conversation. When Ezra Klein raised the possibility of an open Democratic convention last spring, people said it wasn't a good time to have that conversation either. That's the thing about difficult conversations. It feels like there's never a good time for having them. But the reward for making the time and having the conversation is that we learn things about what went well and poorly, and most importantly, about how to conduct ourselves to achieve better results in the future. Now, I'd like to introduce the brave and incredibly knowledgeable and experienced people who will help us understand this question today. Larry Lessig is the Roy Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at the Harvard Law School. Before returning to Harvard, he taught at Stanford Law School, where he founded the Center for Internet and Society, and at the University of Chicago. He clerked for Judge Richard Posner on the Seventh Circuit, and then Judge Antonin Scalia on the United States Supreme Court. Larry has done many, many things and authored many books, including most recently the highly relevant How to Steal a Presidential Election with Matthew Seligman. Elaine Kmark is a senior fellow in governance studies and the director of the Center for Effective Public Management at Brookings. She has been on the Rules Committee of the Democratic National Committee since 1997 and has been a Democratic Party superdelegate for the last 6 conventions. She is an expert and has long experience in American electoral politics and government innovation and reform in the United States. I first met Elaine when I was a first-year junior faculty member here at the Kennedy School many, many years ago. She's the author of Lies That Kill, A Citizen's Guide to Disinformation, and importantly for this discussion, Primary Politics, Everything You Need to Know About How America Nominates Its Presidential Candidates. Daniel Schlossman is the Joseph and Bertha Bernstein Associate Professor of Political Science and studies political parties, American political development, and social movements and political theory. He's written 2 really fantastic books on American political parties and the public, both published by Princeton University Press. The first one was When Movements Anchor Parties, which is about social movements and political parties in American history. And then more recently, just published in 2024, the hollow parties, the many pasts and disorder present of American party politics. Now, today's event is part of the Kennedy School's Candid and Constructive Conversations series. The CCC initiative provides HKS students, staff, and faculty opportunities to learn and practice skills for constructive disagreement across differences. As a school-wide initiative for the next generation of public servants and leaders, CCC programming aims to cultivate an environment and skills of openness, humility, and respect to support the robust exchange of ideas. Finally, as we're entering the election season in the United States, we'd like to remind those who are eligible, only those who are eligible, to register to vote, check out your voter registration status, and make a voting plan. We also want to take this opportunity to let the Harvard community members know about the Harvard Votes Challenge, which is a nonpartisan initiative striving to build a civic culture of participation here at Harvard by increasing voter registration and participation across the entire community. We invite all participants to learn more at voteschallenge.harvard.edu. And then finally, questions from the audience, please submit them at any time using the Q&A function. All right. So now let's get into the discussion. So first is just a simple question that is very general. In retrospect, looking back upon the past, 6 to 8 to 9 months, should there have been a Democratic primary with more choices? This is the Ezra Klein point, who Elaine had a fantastic discussion on Ezra's podcast about this possibility. But what do you guys think? Should there have been a Democratic primary with more choices than Dean Phillips and Joe Biden? Maybe I'll turn it over first to Elaine. What do you think?
Well, I mean, maybe, sure. There should have been, but nobody ran. Okay. I mean, you can't force people to run for president. It's not something, it's not a big secret how to run for president. The Democratic Party has rules. The rules say that you can't charge more than $2,500 to get on a state primary ballot. Again, that's not very much money if you're thinking of running in the whole country, and you can't raise that. You kind of have to wonder what you're doing. The other rules require that you can't ask for more than 5,000 signatures to get on a primary ballot. And again, if you don't have enough support to get 5,000 signatures in a state, well, then maybe you ought to rethink whether or not you can run for president of the United States. So the access issues are very clear. It's easy to get on Democratic primary ballots, okay? It's harder to raise money. It's harder to, if you're starting from nowhere, to have a reputation or develop, to have a name recognition. Those things are hard. But basically, there's no reason why somebody can't run for president other than the basic political reasons. And the political reasons were, when you have an incumbent president, there's a lot of people who could run for president who say, no, I'm not running against the incumbent, because they're friends with them, they owe them things, they've helped them with their bills in Congress, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of people just simply didn't run. So you can say, should it have been better? Well, maybe in retrospect, it would be better to have some more candidates, but no one ran. And frankly, no one of stature thought of running. Dean Phillips, Marianne Williamson, uncommitted, those were on the ballot, and none of them had the stature to challenge a sitting incumbent president.
Great. Thank you very much. Daniel, do you want to jump in? What do you think that is pretty much the right answer? Is, look, there's a process, the barriers are not high, nobody else showed up.
I agree with everything that Elaine said about why that other candidates could have run, other candidates did not run, and that in turn, the Democratic primary electorate was fundamentally united behind Joe Biden as long as he was in the race until this debate in June. The next question, the perhaps saucier question, is, should Joe Biden have run for re-election? And did he make the right choice in 2023 when he chose to go ahead and without getting into kind of questions about presidential disability and what how he could function that I don't think we're going to get the real answers to for a long time until the oral histories and the memoirs come out, that there is good reason to think that a president who wasn't getting any younger, would have been 86 at the end of the second term, might have said that the long-term interest of the Democratic Party had him stepping down, not after all the Sturm und Drang we'll talk about this summer, but in a more considered way. And this is what Ezra Klein was trying to begin to push in February, but I think even before that. And you know, I'm on record in a review I wrote for Dissent of Frank Foer's book about Biden to say that he should have retired a champ. And yes, I think that should have happened, and that we would have been a better party to have had a process to determine, a full process to determine the nominee, rather than what I regard was a totally legitimate but abbreviated process this summer.
Right. So I just one follow-up and open it up to Larry if you want to take on this follow-up, but also Elaine or Danielle or Daniel. So then you have this kind of weird situation in which there's a formally open structure in which anyone can run, but there's a whole normative structure within the capitally Democratic Party that if the incumbent president wants to go, he gets to go, he or she gets to go, everyone else is going to defer. And then so it does seem dysfunctional from a competitive perspective, and probably from a normative small d Democratic perspective, if the incumbent insists on running when many, many other people think that person is not the best candidate to run for president. So isn't that a problem? Maybe not with the formal rules of the DNC or the Democratic Party, but with the normative structure that governs how people are making their decisions about whether to raise their hand.
Well, can I take that up? Because I think Daniel's exactly right. The real question is not should other people have run. The real question is should Joe Biden have run. Here's the problem. For one, I can tell you a personal story. Okay. On February 5th, I attended the House Democratic Retreat. That's the retreat for members of Congress. I went with my husband. I sat 20 feet from Joe Biden. He came out, he gave a teleprompter speech, which was fine. The press left, he left the stage. Then he came back and sat down in a chair next to Hakeem Jeffries. And for 50 minutes, he took questions from Democratic members of Congress. Made jokes with them, remembered their names, remembered their districts, talked sensibly about policy, didn't have notes or anything like that. He had a briefing book on his lap and he never looked at it. So I thought, oh, wait a minute, this is all Republican propaganda, right? Joe Biden is fine. This is ridiculous. He's been a good president. This is ridiculous. And other people had that experience. Simultaneously, though, almost simultaneously, a couple of months later, George Clooney is in Los Angeles at this fancy-dancy fundraiser, and he says, oh, my God, the guy's really, really old. And then, of course, on June 21st, we all saw somebody who was clearly getting older, clearly not ready. Let me just say, I think history will show there's a very human dimension to this. I think I have a mother who just died of dementia. I think dementia comes on slowly, Parkinson's, dementia, whatever you think this is, it comes on in fits and starts. So people were seeing the great Joe Biden that I saw at the Democratic retreat that people had seen a month before in the State of the Union, a guy really in great shape, and other people were seeing the problem. And it wasn't until the whole country saw the problem and the whole party saw the problem that it was clear that Joe Biden could not prosecute this campaign against Donald Trump. And everybody saw that at once. But until that point, right, it was not clear. There was not clarity among the people who were actually seeing the president.
Yes, right. I agree with Daniel that we probably won't know the ins and outs of this till very good historians compile much more detailed accounts than we have now. I was trying to think first, my reaction to the inner circle for Biden that defended his position was anger for quite a while at what I perceived to be deception. But then I think that, Elaine, your observation that both about the pre-debate and the post-debate, about the nature of this reality. Almost everyone in America has an experience with an aging friend or relative of some kind. And I was thinking, well, if I were in Biden's inner circle, how could I think this in an earnest way? And I was thinking about my dad also, who passed recently from Parkinson's. And I think a couple of things go on. As somebody you know and are very close to and love, one, there's the denial, right? You want to think that they're in better shape than they are. But
Exactly
two,
right.
there's a knowledge thing. As you know this person so well, you can fill in the gaps when they don't say things. You know the words that they would have said, and you're imputing maybe a level of cognitive ability that just isn't there because you're able to. You're able to, well, that's kind of how relationships work. But then post-debate, when all of America who doesn't have that relationship sees the reality, something very, very different kind of kicks in there, and we saw that.
That's why I say, Archon, there's a very human dimension to this whole story that I think, as Daniel said, the historians are going to have to sort out over the next many years.
Yeah, good.
So
good.
I think that's right. Although I do think that we should learn a lesson from this experience about the relative power of the Democratic Party over its own nominee. I mean, the convention has now become that the president owns the party and controls what the party does. And that might make sense in the ordinary case. But I think this case demonstrates that having an institution that could have not independent, but at least opportunity to question what the president is doing would have been really valuable. I mean, it's not just that he seemed like he was incapable at a certain point, and he seemed he was capable at another point. All through last year, people were raising the question, why would we think he's in a position to be able to take on Trump and win? And the polling wasn't showing that he was as strong as he was going into the last election. It was showing he was weak. And yet, because the president controls the party, it was hard to structure something that could even raise that question. Now, I say that, and I also want to say we should not ignore the elephant in the room, which is this, for most Democrats, is an existential election. And nobody wanted to do anything that would threaten the ultimate result of the election, which is why I think nobody wanted to run against the president, because we know running against a president weakens the chance of that person ultimately prevailing substantially. And so if anybody was in a position where they could have said something, even just privately, to say to Joe Biden a year ago or 2 years ago, you've had the most consequential presidency since LBJ, and you will be remembered as the person who passed the most important legislation, certainly on climate change, that we've ever seen in the United States. And that's a great victory. But we have to recognize the risk of reality turning out as it in fact has turned out, that you can't compete. And so that's the reason that you need to be thinking about stepping aside. We didn't seem to have those elders, or at least the elders were not willing to intervene. And I think that's a lesson we need to think about going forward, about the place of senior people in the party to make sure the president is actually thinking about the nation or the party all the time, even though he's obviously going to be convinced, or she's convinced, she's the best candidate who could run.
I want to turn it over to Daniel to pick up on that and ask an historical question. In prior eras of American politics, would either the Republican or the Democratic Party, we think of them as stronger parties in that era that are able to pick the candidate who they think will prevail in the relevant election. Is that basically right or wrong? In a prior era, would somebody have said to President Biden, hey, it's not your time now?
It's been a long time since presidents have not been able to secure renomination. And Daniel Klinghardt, who teaches at Holy Cross, has a quite good book about how at the end of the 19th century, and so this is now many eras even before the beginning of the modern nomination system after 1968, that presidents control the national committees. And when they control the national committees, and then they have party infrastructure that is basically at their disposal, raising money, working the connections in the states. And so they are no longer the captives of the state party bosses who are the most important figures all the way through the 19th century, and then in a lesser extent in the 20th. And so when Martin Van Buren wants to get renominated for a third time in 1844. He can't do it. When Ulysses Grant wants to get renominated for a third time in 1880, he can't do it. There are all these kind of one-term presidents. But basically, starting the turn of the 20th century, presidents who want to get renominated. And the big cases of those who don't, Harry Truman in 1952, Lyndon Johnson in 1968, there's a real unpopular war. They're discredited. It's not something like the analog of the Biden situation of 2024, which is we just want to swap out our horse for someone who can cross the river a little faster. So it's a long time. And in turn, I think that the questions of president and party are not just about party strengthening. It's also the whole presidentialization of American politics, the power of the presidency. At some point in the summer, I was the difference between Joe Biden and Gretchen Whitmer is that Joe Biden has the nuclear codes at his disposal and Gretchen Whitmer does not. And that with all of that aura of the modern presidency in so many ways, it becomes harder to build up countervailing party power. I think that what happened this summer was a kind of edge case of what are the limits of presidential dominance of the party. And that is when it is very, very clear to lots of actors around the party that the president is not only not our best candidate going forward, but not really capable of doing the things that need to be done, that there are limits to presidentialization. And it's been an interesting
and we've hit those limits. That's interesting. That this is the edge. This is what it took. This is what it looks like.
This is what it took.
Yeah. Anything short of this, it just wouldn't have.
You know, Archong, I've been joking to people. My book has done really well this year, and I've been joking to people that this book, lived in the obscurity that most academic books live in for many years. It's in its 4th edition. It took 2 geriatric presidential candidates to get people to read the book.
Selecting candidates.
Tim Rosenfeld has been making similar jokes about our book that in fact this was all a big plot for sales. So
that's right.
For us. Working. So let's roll the historical tape forward just a little bit. In the weeks before Biden announces that he's not going to run for president, and I'm thinking of the public pressure was mounting, and here party elites, people who are important in the Democratic Party, start to have conversations of, well, what would it look like? I think almost everyone was very careful to say, well, it's of course Biden's decision, whatever he decides. But then there's a little bit of conversation on the edges of, well, if he were to decide not to run, here's what it might look like. And I think you guys are closer readers than I am, but by my count, James Carville, Nancy Pelosi, Jim Clyburn, and Larry Lessig, I'll go to Larry in a moment, many people suggested and Ezra Klein certainly, some sort of mini competitive process, whether it be town meetings or something before the convention or something at the convention, in which a number of candidates for president would prevent themselves, and there would be some selection process. And even if Harris emerged, the argument from some people was maybe especially if Harris ended up leading the ticket, she would at least have the benefit of having gone through this test and consideration. So before I turn over to Elaine and Dan, I want to ask Larry. Larry, you wrote a proposal, which I tried to amplify a little bit on the platform formerly known as Twitter, with some limited success, about what such a process might look like. And yours was very different from what James Carville, or I think probably Nancy Pelosi, had in mind. Would you take a minute or two and describe what your proposal was and why you thought that would be a good idea?
Yeah, I think that this is a moment where we should think about democratic innovation in a really aggressive way, because I think one of the striking things about what's happened with Kamala Harris is we've seen the absence of a primary has in fact helped the candidate in a really strong way. And that's, I think, because the ordinary way in which primaries function, the kind of election primaries, have lots of flaws built in. The flaws of cost, the flaws of timing, the flaws of participation, the flaws of, the attack of like the demographics of a state. All of those are reasons why people are skeptical. So I'm thinking about innovations that don't necessarily replace those, but complement them. And so the idea that I teed up with help from others is to think about convening a very large kind of Jim Fishkin-esque deliberative poll process to allow candidates to present themselves. You imagine a town meeting like event where televised, they present themselves and they talk about issues, and then the virtual deliberation around those candidates would proceed for the whole of a day, let's say, talking about the candidate in which would be thought of as the most compelling for the election that they're considering. And then at the end, they give a ranked choice voting for those candidates. And, it could be, given the platforms that Stanford has, we have one we've just acquired at Harvard, you could have thousands, tens of thousands participating. And we actually propose that we have one which was a perfectly representative random sample of Democrats participating, and a parallel one, which would be open to anybody who wanted to be participating. And that could be, a million people participating. But the point is, this is a process which technology has now given us, and COVID has trained us how to use, that could begin to facilitate something better, something different from a, standard show up and vote. And the way these would work is you would have these video-like events, and then people would be drawn into rooms that would look something like the screen right now, like 4 or 8 or 12 people who have a chance to talk through things. They would be, the 4 or 8 or 12 would be constituted to make sure it was a diverse group. The algorithms exist to make that possible. And then they give their views at the beginning, give their views at the end, and that process would teach us something about how candidates have an effect on a public. Now, again, I'm not saying it should replace voting. I'm not saying it should replace any ordinary process, but I do think that we need to start imagining democracy in a more inclusive and perfected way than the kind of democracy that we've got that solely relies on who can afford to show up and what the nature of a demographic of a state might be. So that was the suggestion. And the thought was it was easier to organize something like that in the very short time that we had from the moment Joe Biden announced he was not going to run until a convention. I personally was very happy that Kamala secured the nomination in, just a couple of days, just by convincing people that was a better strategy. That was, in my view, perfectly fine. But I think that going forward, we should think about whether this should be added into the mix of what we think about when we think about how to select a candidate, so that we have a richer, deeper sense of how people are connecting in the context of a race.
Great, thank you. And then maybe I'll ask Elaine and Daniel both, if you were pressed and had to propose some sort of more competitive process in those months between, I guess, August and the Democratic and the first few weeks of August, I guess, what would that have looked like? And then for both of you, would you prefer what actually happened to that, like, best case competitive process? I hope the question is clear.
Let me start here, because I think there's a little factual basis missing, okay? The decision on the nominee of a political party is not a decision made in primaries. It is a decision made in convention by delegates. 14 million people voted in Democratic primaries. What they were doing is they were voting for delegates. They were voting for approximately 4,000 delegates on the Democratic side, there's about 2,000 on the Republican side. Those people in any scenario are the ultimate deciders on who is the nominee. As a young woman, I walked up to Walter Mondale after his speech and gave him the paperwork to sign that he accepted the nomination of the Democratic Party of the United States. Okay, so that they are the ones. You didn't need an alternate system, because in fact, once Biden said he wasn't running, guess what? The decision automatically went to 4,000 delegates. They were certified, they had run. Some of them in some states, they ran on the ballot. In Maryland and Alabama and Illinois, for instance, they are elected on the ballot with the presidential candidate. Can't get much more democratic than that. In other states, they are elected in congressional district meetings that are set up by the party, where they bring their friends and their community, and people elect them. These 4,000 people are not some random group of elites. They are actually elected by somebody who in the Democratic Party. So what happened, in fact, was as everybody was spinning their theories, and Carville, et cetera, Nancy Pelosi, et cetera, who everybody missed was the deciders. The deciders, by the way, were busy deciding. Okay. And this was led by a man named Ken Martin, who's the president of the Association of Democratic State Chairs. The state chairs were in constant communication with what they were hearing in their delegations, okay, in their states, in their delegations, and also following the national movement. On the week before Biden dropped out, they got together and they said, okay, let's just hold for the time being with Biden and see where this thing is going. Because, by the way, everybody was sensitive to not wanting to get up Biden's Irish. They didn't want to get his Irish up, which means it's an old-fashioned saying. They didn't want to back him to a corner and make him even more stubborn, right, than he was being. People knew he needed to get out, and they were kind of gently figuring out how to get him out. Then on the Friday before the Sunday where Joe Biden announced he was leaving the race, the executive committee, the full Association of State Chairs met. This is about 200 people. And they agreed that the thing to do to prevent an ugly food fight in the Democratic Party was to call their delegations together and poll them and see who was for Kamala and who wasn't. Tennessee met on 9 o'clock that night, that Sunday night, and endorsed Harris. South Carolina met next on that night. On the next day, people endorsed Harris. There was a wave of 25 states. By the time that of Monday, a Tuesday morning, 32 hours after Biden got out of the race and endorsed Harris, enough delegates had said, I'm for Harris. I'm a Virginia delegate. I got my questionnaire, and there were two choices. Do you intend to vote for Harris, or would you like to vote for someone else? There was no someone else, guys. There was no someone else. Okay. So people voted for Harris because, first of all, we'd run out of time. Secondly, remember who gets to be delegates, who runs for delegates. They're your county chairman. They're your county committeemen. They're your county commissioners. They're very local politicians. Guess what? They are also the people who get called up, because they call me all the time, when, Vice President Harris is coming to Arlington to do a daycare center. Would you like to come? You get invited to these things all 4 years. Guess what? These people knew Kamala Harris. They knew Kamala Harris and they knew Joe Biden. They didn't know anybody else. Okay. They didn't know Gretchen Whitmer. They didn't know Josh Shapiro. They knew these people. It's not like they took a flyer and said, oh, well, maybe she's going to be okay. They had seen the development. They'd seen her talent. They'd seen her grow from where she was as a 2020 candidate. So 32 hours from Biden getting out to Kamala Harris having the delegates. And all of this other stuff, right, that was going on was kind of theoretical, right? Because the people who are making the decision were in fact making the decision. And
I completely agree. I completely agree they had the power to make the decision. The question is, what is the input they should be taking in making the decision they make?
You have a deliberative that you have a deliberative poll, fine. I just don't think that should be in any way a substitute for.
But Daniel, again, Daniel, again, I did not say it's a substitute. I said it's an input into the process of making the decision. And so again, as I said, I'm happy things turned out as they did. And after tonight, we'll see whether that wish was as good as I think it will be. But all that I'm saying is that in recognizing skepticism, cynicism about the political process, and especially about the political process inside of parties, what could we be adding to the process that gives people additional reason to have confidence in the outcome? So imagine there had been a deliberative poll. Imagine the deliberative poll had overwhelmingly said exactly what the outcome the delegates had done. There would have been it would have been easier to rally skeptics in that context. Or if you'd done what Carville had said, and that process had also produced the result that the delegates had done, I think it could have strengthened it. So we have to separate out what should have happened in this particular case, which is an exception for 1,000 reasons, not to mention the existential question, from a more general question, which is, are we finished with democratic innovation in America? Is it done? Are we going to have something like these party primaries, these terrible party primaries for all sorts of other reasons people are reforming with the Final Five process? Or can we start thinking about what can we add that would make it better? And that was the only reason I was trying to suggest what I did.
Right. So to be clear, so Larry's proposal in the Medium post was for there to be these citizen assemblies, and they would, I don't know, maybe at the end of it, vote or something like that, but they would make recommendations or findings, maybe not even recommendations, that then the delegates would consider in their process of, so the delegates would still be the deciders. The citizen assemblies would be an additional input. But so, yeah, Daniel, where are you on this?
So a few thoughts, mostly to Elaine, that it is totally right that given the choice that they got, the delegates decided and in very short order made their decision, and that they would end up with an administration whose accomplishments they are broadly proud of, the Black woman vice president, the logical focal point, the figure they knew. That is all making sense. The question that I have about what happened is, was there a world in which other players in the Democratic Party could have signaled more strongly, not just we need a new nominee that's not Joe Biden, but we need an all new ticket? And my sense is that that was opening up in their eyes more chaos at a time when there wasn't much time to, and a feeling that what we wanted to do was to improve our chances of beating Trump without risking some kind of blowback. But delegates absolutely decided, given what they were offered. And in a sense, the next question is, why is it that the claims of let Biden go on his own terms were not accompanied by, and we need a full process with full choices? Because I think that might have pushed the delegates if delegates were responding to that kind of world, they might have been in a different place.
Can I just say, I think if Biden had the debate he had, right, or some kind of presentation he had in June of 2023, I think he would have had challengers, right? There would have been time to get on primary ballots. People would have gotten on the ballots. It's easy to get on a Democratic primary ballot, or a Republican one for that matter. It's easy to get on these ballots. I think he would have had a challenger. I think the pressure on him to step back would have been enormous, etc. This all happened when there was no time.
Yeah.
And one of the things that motivated the state party chairs in this is that they're the ones that put together the system. So all the organization that it would take to do a poll, and I think Larry's idea is an interesting one, but who was going to do that, right? Who was going to do that in 4 weeks? Where was the money going to come from? How was the selection going to happen? What about these people in the Democratic Party and the state committees? Okay, let's talk about that. All right, there are approximately 250 people on average in a state committee in a state. That ends up being nearly 10,000 people nationally. They are constantly involved in this. They know a lot about voters because they talk to voters all the time. They talk to voters when they try to elect the county commissioner, when they try to elect the state representative. They actually are pretty good at this stuff. Would they be interested in giving this over to some random sample of Democrats? Absolutely not.
Well, again, but Elaine, so
Yeah.
I'm not saying anything is giving over to anybody. I'm just saying people are taking in certain kinds of information. And one thing you said, which is really important, we should not miss. You said they had the power to vote, to make their choice, because Biden withdrew. And that's right. If Biden hadn't withdrawn, then many of these states are bound. Many of these delegates would have been bound regardless of what they thought.
No, they're not bound.
No,
That's
not
that's a
bound.
misnomer. Delegates are not bound. Rule 13J of the Democratic rules say very clearly, delegates shall, in all good conscience, vote for the person they were elected to represent. They are not bound. Biden himself, in his NATO press conference
Yeah.
following that debate, said, quote, delegates can do whatever the hell they want to do. They are not bound. And that they knew that. The country didn't know that. And press people, I must have answered this question 25 million times. Press people kept saying to me, oh, when is Biden going to release the delegates? I said, there's no such thing as releasing delegates. In the Republican Party, there is. Republican Party, the candidate has to release in writing their delegates before they can vote for somewhere else. These delegates were never bound, and they knew it. They knew they were not bound. And that's why the discussions that were going on in the state delegations were critical, because their choice was, we know at some point we may have to abandon this guy. And we may have to abandon this guy, and we're going to go for Harris. That was
I think a challenge for those of us, Elaine and me, certainly, who want to tell a pro-party story is to figure out how, on the one hand, those kinds of discussions should not be in public because you want to be serious and candid and not have the Jonathan Martins and Dave Weigels reporting on you immediately. On the other hand, we want to tell the world that parties are doing their work as parties and doing a good job of it, and not letting this all be totally silent and letting the void be filled with anti-party talk, and how to do that. And maybe write something ex post beyond what we're doing here of this is how it went down, that the party did its work, is an important thing to be doing.
Yeah, and that process has lots of inputs naturally. Like it has a Fox News town hall, which is an input into that process. It has polls, which are inputs into the process. I guess the only feels to me like a small point, but I'm surprised it's resisted. The only small addition is to say, let's try to do something that's actually more democratically healthy, the sort of thing that we see happening in citizen assemblies across the world right now, that could actually tell us something serious and deep about what people are thinking beyond, what flashes on CNN or what happens to be on the leading thing on a regular poll. And like adding that to the mix, it seems to me, could give us a richer sense of what people think. And if delegates ultimately have to exercise that judgment, something that they would consider in exercising the judgment, just like they consider what the polls say, and just what they can consider what happened on CNN in the latest town hall.
So I wanted to, before going to the Q&A, address two questions. One, I'll just address in a comment, and then the second is to kind of put back to you. The first kind of question to ask, I would like people in the audience to ask themselves is, did this process result in the best outcome for the capital E Democratic Party? And there's two ways to think about that. One is in the highly time-constrained way in which the stepping down of Biden's, when Biden steps down, there is only 4 weeks to select another candidate. Enormous pressure on that scenario. Probably the quick ascendance of Harris, I'm going to offer, is the best thing for the capital E Democratic Party in the general election. But then Elaine's counterfactual is super interesting. If Biden's debate had happened, disastrous debate had happened 1 year ago, maybe there would have been a more competitive process, and an even stronger candidate than Harris may have emerged. Or if Harris rose to the top of the pile, maybe she would be in a stronger position as a result of that vetting and competition and having to articulate her positions and defend them for a longer period of time. So we're in this kind of weird situation in which the rules and norms of the Democratic Party set into motion, in this extraordinary circumstance, a set of dominoes that probably is not the optimum on Elaine's counterfactual, but given the short amount of timing, may be the best thing for the Democratic Party. Now, I'm just going to set that out there and people can reflect on that. The question that I wanted to put back to you very briefly is, okay, is what happened, let's concede that it is the best for the capitally Democratic Party. The next question is what happened in retrospect going to be good or bad for the legitimacy of the 2024 election? So this is a question not just for people who support Harris, but for all Americans. So let me put the point very provocatively. A friend of mine who follows politics less closely than the people on this Zoom call joked that it's as if Harris was stuck at level 3 of a video game, and then she got a cheat code that hopped her up to level 9. And President Trump, kind of piling on, has complained that he spent millions of dollars running against Biden, and now he has to start over again. Do you guys on the call think that this norm breaking, in the sense that the shift from Biden to Harris is definitely not normal? Even Johnson resigned, months and months before on the presidential election clock. Do you think that this norm breaking kind of turn will decrease trust and legitimacy in the 2024 election at a moment when the legitimacy of elections is kind of on the rocks, especially among people who don't support Harris? And would a different democratic process, small d democratic, created fewer legitimacy concerns? Or no, it's not really a legitimacy concern. The Democratic Party is going to do what it does. Who's going to win the election is going to win the election, and people will not really associate that with the strength of our system or not.
Look, I'll just say I think it was fine. Okay. I think there was no other real alternative. And what people who question legitimacy have to understand is that every single person who voted for Kamala Harris in Chicago was elected by Democrats. They were elected. So we have a representative democracy. We elect our members of Congress in the Senate. We let them raise our taxes. We let them decide if our kids are going to war. All right. That's what representative democracy is. This is a version of representative democracy. Not only do you elect the delegates in the primaries, those delegates, they don't just vote for the presidential candidate. They vote for the party platform. They vote for rules for the subsequent conventions and parties. They do a lot of things. And when we elect them, we are delegating a lot of choices to them. So I don't think that there is a real legitimacy problem here, unless you have a legitimacy problem with representative democracy in the first place.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And I would strengthen it just by saying the critical move here is that Joe Biden says he's not running. The party has to then choose who's going to be the candidate. And so absolutely, it's legitimate for them to choose a candidate after the leading candidate says that he's not running. And even like when I suggested the idea of like a process to complement the information that the delegates would have them and make their choice, an essential part of that process is that somebody needs to choose to run in addition to Kamala Harris. And I think the reality is none of the leading candidates were going to do that, just because they all had the sense, I think, as I certainly had, I think as people on this call have suggested, that there was an existential moment here we had to get over and get through as effectively as they can. So it would be hard to kind of pretend to run. You had to actually seriously run, and they then say things like, this is why she shouldn't be the candidate nominee for the president, and everybody recognizing that's just weakening the opportunity of the party. So I think in the circumstances, I think what happened made a lot of sense. And I certainly agree that this statement about legitimacy is just a misunderstanding. Now, of course, that's not accidental, it's intentional. But it just should be resisted. There's no legitimacy question if somebody chooses not to run, period.
The non-event of nobody else chose to run is one of those very, very hard things to study. More generally, I will say, E. Schatzheimer, political scientist in the middle of the last century, said that democracy is between the parties, not within the parties. And that's my absolute bottom line, that Democrats have a set of procedures starting with the votes of primary goers, but this is just a different process that with different nature of legitimacy from a general election and that it is a category error to transfer to the one to the other, full stop.
Right. Okay, good. So I want to pick up on that with a question from the audience, which pushes it even further. And so the question is there an inherent conflict between the internal decision-making processes of political parties on one hand, and on the other hand, the democratic principles that they promote in public? How should they balance internal control with the desire for transparency and voter trust? And so for the people who want a little social theory on this, the most important book on this is no doubt Robert Michael's book on the German SDP, the Social Democratic Party, in which the puzzle that he poses is that there's a political party that sets out to be small d democratic, but ends up highly oligarchic. And this is where the phrase iron law of oligarchy comes from. And his argument is a stronger version. I don't know if Daniel would own this argument, but it's a stronger version. It says, look, if you're a political party and you want to win elections, you cannot be small d democratic because you exist in a highly competitive environment. An army is not small d democratic unless it wants to lose every battle and every war. Same thing with a political party. It's got to be kind of, this isn't my argument, this is his, kind of top down, controlled in order to do the things, make the decisions that a party needs to make in order to have the best chances of winning an election. So then this is a position, I think, that is less small d democratic than anyone on this panel, right? He says, look, there is no obligation. In fact, it would be counterproductive for a political party to be small d democratic. And I think Michaels would agree with Daniel's argument that democracy, you have to think, occurs between parties, not within them. Thoughts on the question from the audience about the inherent contradiction, perhaps, tension?
Well, let me start with this because, and with a little story. So one of the two Republican conventions I went to because of my research for my book was the 2016 Republican convention in Cleveland. And at that convention, the leadership of the party took a powder. All right. They didn't go. Okay. The senator from Arizona famously said to a reporter, I have to mow my lawn. Okay. They did not want any part of Donald Trump or that convention. They abdicated. And modern political parties, once they adopted primaries, have largely abdicated that role. Except when you get into an exceptional circumstances like the candidate drops out or drops dead for that matter after the primaries. So we don't have that strong internal top down in political parties because frankly, if we did, the Republican Party would not have nominated Donald Trump in 2016. They nominated him because he won primaries, he won delegates, he sent a bunch of evangelical delegates to the 2016 convention. They were all for Trump. And there was an attempt, but there was a never Trump attempt on the first day of the convention. I wrote about it in my book. That's about the only place it's ever been written about because the press just doesn't cover these things. There was an attempt to break open that convention and it failed. And there is no party leadership, right? There is no part who can go in and say, no, you can't do that in the face of delegates elected in primaries. It's just gone. And now this was a different situation. We had the delegates already elected. They already knew Kamala Harris. They were Biden people. They knew Kamala Harris because they were Biden people, etc. Different story. It was like LBJ handing a lot of his delegates to Hubert Humphrey when he dropped out of the race in 68. So that sort of notion doesn't really apply to American political parties anymore, Democrats or Republicans.
Yeah, and I think the objective of the party, which I think is a fair one, to pick a candidate who's going to win, is obviously very sensitive to exactly what happens leading up to the convention, as this event showed. And I do like the conception of the democratic rules, which say that the party delegates need to make the choice that is the choice that's reflecting their best judgment. Of course, a bunch of states have tried to resist that, have explicit laws in 22 states that tell them they don't have that freedom. And there's never been a court case to resolve. The Supreme Court's never resolved. Justice Stewart thinks the First Amendment bans those state laws. And I would agree with Justice Stewart, but the equivalent on the Electoral College is a case that I took to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no, the states could bind the electors to vote one way or the other. So I think that we ought to embrace the idea that the choice of the delegates is the important choice for the purpose of the party, and then be more open to thinking about how do we make sure the choice of the delegates is reflecting the best judgment for the party, given lots of input about like what the broadest, most representative sense of America would be about the question. And that's the innovation that I think we need to think about adding, not changing their power, but changing what they get to see beyond the stuff that they see right now.
Yeah, that's great. Here's a question from Jessica Mink from the audience. I don't know if anyone feels like they can answer this question. It's an interesting one. So what can the Republican Party do if their candidate falls apart? Would it look like just what just happened, in which case I suppose J.D. Vance would be the nominee? And then she continues, he seems more and more of the time to be on the edge of that. So I guess there's that specific question, but then is the shape and decision process, do you expect the Republican Party process to be kind of similar to the Democratic Party process?
I'll make a general point, and then I'll let Elaine talk a little bit about the rules, which is that what happened with the Democratic Party is basically, in an extraordinary circumstance, an ordinary political party doing its work in ways that show that this is a healthy party,
a real party,
all the way down to its grassroots, from the elites, all the parts, sometimes stumbling in ways that show it's exercising its collective capacity. The Republican Party now is not that party. It is and that talking about the parties, even if they have these rules in parallel of how do the delegates work, what do the national committees do, that it is not a fundamentally normal political party at this point. It is, in many ways, system defying, worrisome to political scientists who are thinking about democracy, that over the last decade, it may have moderated a bit on the sort of role of government questions from the Paul Ryan era, but has moved far out on the questions of legitimacy. This is 1/6. This is the Trump dominance top to bottom, such that Lara Trump, the daughter-in-law, is a top official at the Republican National Committee, and that it was a very good question that Elaine will answer on the particulars, but I don't want to lose sight of the general story, which is a very, very different kind of party. So,
well, and let me just go the particulars, because I think it's I think one of the things the question, I mean, you're absolutely right, Daniel. The Republican Party is kind of out there historically, but let's suppose something happened to Trump. Okay, let's suppose he died. Let's suppose he had a debilitating stroke. Okay. The structure is very much similar to the Democratic Party. If it happened before the convention, their convention delegates would decide. They wouldn't necessarily, frankly, have decided on Vance. I mean, they decided on Kamala Harris because they actually knew her, because she'd been vice president for 3.5 years, and that's what vice presidents do. They go to the Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners. I mean, they get to know. So they wouldn't, but they would have picked somebody. If, in fact, it happened now, for either party, the Republican National Committee, which consists of about 200 plus people who are the state party chairs, vice chairs, and a national committee man or woman from each state, they would be called into session and they would choose another nominee. Period. End of sentence. Same thing for the Democrats. If something happened to Kamala Harris, the DNC would be called in. So both parties have thought this through. I mean, they've been at this for a long time. They've thought it through, right?
What happens? Situations.
Yeah. What happens if the candidate dies? What happens if, for some reason, the candidate can't run? So it's very similar, and I think that answers the part of the question.
Good, great. So we're out of time, and I'm just delighted with this conversation. It's so interesting and well-informed, and from three very different sets of expertise and background that all brought together and coalesced. I'll leave you with a thought, and someone can fact check me on this. I believe that this will be the first election since 1996 in which there hasn't been a Bush, Clinton, or Biden on the president or vice presidential ticket. So times they are a-changing. Thanks for joining, everyone, and have a wonderful day. And thank you very
That was
much,
fun.
Elaine and Daniel.